All right, welcome to our third lecture of the week. Finally, we're talking about World War II in the Pacific. So last time we talked about China and Japan, we left off talking about them in the 19th century and their very different responses to European empire. And today we'll pick back up with them. So first to China. The Qing dynasty was severely weakened over the course of the 19th century, especially due to its wars, the Opium Wars in particular, with Britain. So they'd really failed to modernize, which was, as you know, one of their problems, but it continued to be a problem. A group of radicals began to conspire against the emperor. They end up overthrowing the emperor, forcing him to abdicate in February of 1912. The emperor is pictured there, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty. That obviously is 2 decades after he was forced to abdicate. He was about, I think, 6 years old when he abdicated, and it was done under the advice of his ministers. Now, into this power vacuum, there are a lot of warlords who are competing with each other about who's going to rule China, and that goes on for about 10 years. But then we get the formation of 2 parties. The Russian Revolution in 1917 inspired many Chinese thinkers and ultimately led to the creation of the Chinese Communist Party in 1921. But there were also those in China who wanted a democracy, and they formed the Nationalist Party, which was led by Chiang Kai-shek, who's pictured on the right. Now, the Nationalist Party was funded and supported by Russia, but the money came with a bit of a catch. That the only way they would give the nationalists money was if the nationalists united with the Communist Party. And so they do. They create something known as the First United Front, sort of a coalition party. Ultimately, this doesn't pan out in the long run because Chiang Kai-shek gets really nervous about the communists, as he should have been. And ultimately, he kicks the CCP members along with their leader Mao Zedong out of the group. Now, Mao Zedong takes his followers, they move south into southern China, and they really work on developing a new form of communism. China is not industrialized, much like Russia was not in 1917. And so Mao cannot rely on exactly what Marx said needed to happen. There's not enough workers. So what he does is he focuses on the peasants and the farmers, the people who have lost the most in this system. And then he paints the landlords, the landholders, as the class enemy. So much like Lenin had to do, Mao also has to get a bit creative, making Marx's ideas work for his situation. In response to the communist threat, Chiang Kai-shek took the city of Beijing, but he wasn't able to subdue the northern warlords. Nevertheless, China was at least nominally unified. The capital was in the city of Nanjing, and the nationalists were in control. So now to Japan. As you know from previous lecture, Japan was very focused on building their own empire, and they had big designs for Asia. And so China becoming more stable was really scary to the Japanese government because they had these big plans, and if China became more powerful and stable, China might be able to really make those plans a lot harder to achieve. So the Japanese, over the course of the 1920s and into the 30s, become more and more militaristic. And the first step towards this militarism was in 1928 when Japanese army members stationed in Manchuria blew up the train of a Chinese warlord who had supported Chiang Kai-shek. This was followed in 1931 by the Mukden incident, in which the Japanese military engineered another railroad bombing, which was blamed on local warlords and used as a pretext to annex Manchuria. They're basically just annexing a big chunk of China because they want it, and they make up a reason to do it. Now, this is condemned by the League of Nations, the US, etc. But just like we saw in Europe, nobody is really interested or willing to send in troops or pull out the big guns at this point. Now, after this, they will launch their full-on offensive against the rest of China in 1937. Now, ultimately, Japan will never achieve China's complete submission, but they will exact a terrible toll on the Chinese population. Now, one of the first things that the Japanese invaders will do is they will capture the capital of Nanjing, also called Nanking. And this is now known as the Rape of Nanking. And this is the first major atrocity against civilians in the Second World War. Now, the Japanese believed that they needed to defeat China really quickly in order to avoid a war of attrition. Japan doesn't have a ton of resources. They know they need them. They don't have time to get bogged down in a long war. So they subject the capital of Nanking to the first major atrocity of the war. Scholars still debate the actual number of casualties, but a conservative estimate puts them at between 200 and 300,000 people slaughtered in deliberately gruesome ways, like being hacked to death, burned alive, and beheaded. Additionally, rape was systematically used as a means of terror and subjugation, and as many as 100,000 Chinese women were raped by the Japanese soldiers. The message the Japanese were trying to impart was that this is what other Chinese cities would endure if they didn't give up. But just like the British during the Blitz, the Chinese refused to capitulate, and the Chinese simply continued to move the capital city around China for the rest of the war. And the Chinese never give in. They continue to fight even though they lose many people. Now, Japan will use their colonies in Manchuria, Korea, and Taiwan to launch their larger empire. They will portray this empire building as constructing the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. They sort of tried to sell it to the people they were conquering as sort of, aren't you tired of being ruled by white Europeans? You know, we will come rule you. Will create this Asian empire that will be so much better. Really, what the Japanese needed for this empire was resources. They need oil, metals, rubber, raw materials. Because Japan is a small island and it's not rich in these kind of resources. So they need these from other places. Now, mounting tensions with the United States over China had already resulted in sanctions. At this point, Japan imported most of their oil from the United States. And I know it seems kind of weird today to think about the US as a major oil supplier on this level, but we were at this point. And these sanctions even more pushed Japan out into the world to get more oil. It's kind of a vicious circle here. In the summer of 1941, the Japanese government decided they wanted to extend the empire into the Dutch East Indies, as well as further into Southeast Asia, even if this meant they might go to war with the United States. Now, when they decide to bomb Pearl Harbor, this is a very calculated decision. Sometimes I think films portray this as though the Japanese were very short-sighted and didn't know what they were doing. They did. All they were trying to do was delay U.S. power in the Pacific. Tensions had been rising between Japan and the U.S. ever since World War I. And so the Japanese pretty much believed that war with the U.S. was a foregone conclusion. It was just a matter of when. And so they go on the offensive, bomb the fleet at Pearl Harbor, believing that will give them 6 months to do what they need to do in Asia to get the resources they need to fight the war. Particularly to end the war in China is their hope. Now, they're especially keen on this plan because, as Hitler had by 1941 knocked out a lot of European powers, that meant that French colonies and British colonies in the Pacific were weak. And the Japanese took advantage of this. In 1941, they invaded Vietnam, which had been a French colony. They also will be able to take some British colonies like Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, and Burma, and even threaten the crown jewel of the British Empire, India. And here you can see a map that's really nicely color-coded for the time period of when Japan is taking these different pieces. Now, Japan justified their aggression on the grounds that they were actually anti-colonial and pan-Asian. They promised to drive out the Europeans and to build a new order reflecting Asia for Asians. In practice, though, the Japanese made terrible demands on the people that they conquered. They developed myths of Japanese racial purity and supremacy and treated especially the Chinese and the Koreans with great brutality. During the war, Japan put up to about 4 million Koreans to work for its empire, forcibly imported another 700,000 Korean men as laborers, and pressed up to 200,000 young women into service as prostitutes for Japanese soldiers. And these women were colloquially known as the comfort women, but that's just a nice way of saying sex slave. These women were told that they were being given a job in an office, and they'd show up to work and it would be a brothel, and they would not be allowed to leave, and they would be forced to service as many as 40 to 50 soldiers every day. This was incredibly brutal. Many of these women didn't survive. So again, the promises that they're making versus the reality are quite starkly different. Now, at the same time that the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, they also invade the Philippines, which at this point was held by the United States. The United States had taken this as part of the Spanish-American War, and then they had fought, the U.S. Army had fought against Filipinos to take this around the turn of the century. But by the 1940s, the Philippines was being transitioned to being a Commonwealth state. So what that means is the Philippines were going to be kind of like a protectorate, like Guam is today. That they would have their own government system, but that they would still be attached to the United States. And General Douglas MacArthur, who's pictured there, was the one stationed in the Philippines to help them with this transition. So what that means is that there weren't that many American soldiers on the Philippines as there would normally have been, because they were in a period of transition. So on December 7th, 1941, same day as Pearl Harbor, the Japanese begin their invasion of the Philippines. Now, this will take until June of 1942 for the Japanese to be successful. One of the many problems with taking the Philippines from the American side was that the Japanese controlled the Pacific. And with the destruction of the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii on December 7th, the U.S. didn't have any ships close by to send reinforcements or supplies. General Douglas MacArthur is eventually snuck out. He doesn't really want to leave, but the U.S. doesn't want one of their top generals being caught by the Japanese. The American soldiers and the Filipino soldiers fighting with them hold out as long as they can, until basically they are forced into surrendering in June of 1942. Now, the Philippines will finally be retaken by the United States in 1945, but retaking them is just as much of hard work as defending them in the first place. It's incredibly bloody fighting. Now, as I said, the Japanese were right almost 6 months almost to the T here, in that the U.S. fleet is ready in the Pacific by June of 1942. Now, the U.S. was inexperienced in comparison to the Japanese and less prepared for war, but nonetheless, at the Battle of Midway, it did begin to turn the tide of the war in the Pacific. The United States had been able to break the code of the Japanese and found out that the next Japanese target was the island of Midway, which you can see in a tiny dot on the map. The U.S. carriers were placed in a position to surprise the Japanese fleet on their way to Midway. Scout planes were able to locate the Japanese fleet. The Japanese were caught while refueling and were thus vulnerable. Basically, the U.S. had been able to get anyone, Americans off of Midway, so that when the Japanese went to fly over to bomb it, You don't have many American casualties at all. And then they put their big guns, literally and figuratively, into surprising the Japanese. They've flown back, they're now refueling, and were incredibly vulnerable. Ultimately, the U.S. sank 4 fleet carriers that had 322 aircraft and over 5,000 Japanese sailors and airmen. Now, this is kind of like the Battle of Britain, where no one really knew at the time how important this was going to be in the long run, but later it became very evident. The Battle of Midway is a big success for the U.S. and a defeat for the Japanese in the sense that it halts the Japanese progression into the Pacific towards the United States. And from here, the United States will choose a strategy of island hopping as they start taking key islands away from the Japanese as they move their way to the Japanese homeland. Here's some more imagery. The Battle of Midway. Now, one other thing we need to talk about is something known as Unit 731. Now, Unit 731 is not often talked about. I know I did not learn anything about it when I was in your position. And we'll see why that is in just a minute. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, we already know destruction came along with that. The Japanese knew they weren't invincible and that other nations were developing biological weapons, most notably the Soviets. And they wanted to develop their own biological weapons to maintain their independence and their empire, and thus they began experimentation. Chemical warfare, as you know, had been developed during World War I, first used by the Germans in 1915, but then everybody developed the same technology. And World War I had really begun the idea of total warfare. To win a war, many people felt during World War II, you had to be willing to employ whatever tactics necessary, no matter how cruel. Now, in the 1920s, chemical warfare was banned by international law, but during World War II, nobody really paid attention to that. Now, the program known as Unit 731 was part of this attempt to find new ways of biological warfare, and it was headed up by a man named Shiro Ishii. Now, some historians regarded him as arrogant, yet loyal to the emperor, yet we do know that he embezzled a lot of money from the government. He had a very single-minded purpose to become known as the father of biological weapons. Side note, if you are looking for a name for yourself in history, maybe that's not the one you choose. Now, he was a very good manipulator, and he began to recruit allies to create a research lab in Manchuria over which he would have total control. He kept this plan secret from all but his closest associates, yet this could not have happened without the knowledge of Emperor Hirohito. And we know that some of his family members ended up visiting the lab. Now, the plan was approved by the emperor in 1936, and Ishii left to oversee the building. Now, it was known in the area as a water supply unit, so again, trying to be secretive. Now, because the Japanese saw themselves as superior to other peoples of Asia, Ishii and his scientists believed that the Chinese would make perfect specimens to experiment on. In fact, they didn't even see the Chinese as people. Now, they will initially bring in prisoners to experiment on, and then they will expand to just snatching up Chinese civilians. It didn't really matter to them age, gender, they would just snatch up whoever could. They were given unlimited money by the Japanese government to fund this program. Now, one of the key parts of their research was researching the Black Death, bubonic plague. So what they did is at this facility, they cultivated the bubonic plague, and then they tried to figure out some way to disseminate it across long distances. One of their plans was taking, as I'm sure many of you know, Black Death is carried by fleas in their gut. They usually hang out on rats. Rats then usually are the unintentional transporter. Then lice jump on humans, infect the humans. So what they tried to do was have infected lice on rats and then drop them by balloons into areas. It sounds really crazy, but it actually worked. We have many accounts of outbreaks of the Black Death in China in the 1940s where it would kill up to 50,000 people in an area. They also worked on developing bombs that would explode and spread the bubonic plague bacteria. And then they would go into the area in hazmat suits to inspect how much damage they had done. They did try to develop a way to transport the bubonic plague by air in the hopes of hitting the United States, but this was never successful. They also conducted experiments on human beings. They would subject them to cold temperatures to try to see how long people could survive before frostbite, how long you could live after frostbite, all sorts of terrible things. They also had a shrapnel test where they would tie a person to a pole and then detonate bombs at various distances from them to see how shrapnel affected human skin and internal organs. And then they would patch you up and have you do it again and again and again and again until you died. This would have been absolutely a horrible experience. We know that hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens died at Unit 731, but we don't know how many. And there are some reasons for that, which I'll get to in just a minute. Now you're probably wondering, why have I never heard about this before? This is horrifying. Well, after the end of the war, the United States knew about this. And so they sent over American scientists to investigate. And the American scientists said, look, we know there's some really intense stuff that happened here, but we really want to know what their research concluded because we're Americans and we can't conduct horrifying research like this. We need the information. And so Shiro Ishii made a deal with the United States government that they would not put him on trial for war crimes and he would give him all the research he had done. And that's why we've never heard of it. It's becoming more and more talked about, as it should, and I think it's important for us to talk about it because it shows that the atrocities of World War II and the disregard for human life was not relegated to Europe. It was in the Pacific theater as well, which is a sad realization to be sure, but it's important as a historian to know that fact. Now, as I said, the U.S. strategy for moving through the Pacific was one of island hopping. Now, the U.S. knew they couldn't just jump directly to the mainland. That just was not going to work. And so they begin by taking the Marshall Islands, eventually Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the Philippines, again, slowly moving themselves towards the Japanese homeland. And they also knew that if they deprived Japan of enough of their resource-rich colonies, Japan would not be able to fight the war. Of course, on the left, we have the very famous picture of the flag raising at Iwo Jima. Of course, I'm sure many of you know that's actually the second flag raising. There was not a picture taken of the first one. And the picture on the right is of American soldiers fighting on Okinawa. Now the concern became, as the U.S. got closer and closer to Japan, was that the fighting on Iwo Jima and Okinawa had been so hard, so difficult, they began to consider what an invasion of a home island would be like. The number of a projected 1 million American dead started to circulate amongst American military planners as an estimate. But no historian has ever been able to trace where that estimate came from. It's almost like it had appeared out of thin air, but no one actually worked out the math for it. By the spring of 1945, the summer of 45, the war in Europe was over, and soldiers and sailors from the European theater would soon be sent to the Pacific, as well as the Soviets were going to turn their armies onto the Japanese as well, per their agreements with the U.S. At this point, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was now the largest navy in the world and arguably in history. The Japanese Imperial Navy only had a few ships left at this point. They'd been fighting for 14 years at this point, remember that. But most of the Japanese ships lacked the fuel to even go out to sea because, again, they needed those colonies for oil. Now they don't have them. No way you can go sailing without fuel in this case. In terms of geography, the Pacific War had been huge. 6 million square miles of land and ocean. In human numbers, it was comparatively small when compared to Europe. The Soviets had mobilized 12 million men against Germany's 10 million. Britain had 5 million mobilized and the US had 3 million. In the Pacific, Japan had mobilized 6 million soldiers, but 5/6 of them were deployed in China. So not even the brunt of the Japanese army is fighting the US army. So after Okinawa, the scale of the Pacific threatened to expand even bigger. Not only were Americans in Europe going to be redeployed, but also British and Soviet troops would be redeployed. The mountainous geography of Japan promised to make the fighting incredibly hard. Admiral William Leahy, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, argued to President Harry Truman that if Okinawa and Iwo Jima were any indication, that the invasion of Japan itself could take 767,000 men, which would mean an estimated 268,000 dead. So we actually have hard and fast numbers there rather than some weird estimation. In an attempt to avoid loss on whatever scale it would be, the U.S. chose to go with a strategic bombing campaign. Up to this point, these bombings had done little to impact the war. From here forward, targets were to be subjected not sort of precision level bombing, but to low-level drenching by incendiary bombs at night, which would create firestorms that would burn entire cities very quickly. As a nation that at the time had a lot of wood and paper buildings, Japan's cities were sure to go up in flames rather quickly. On March 9, 1945, the U.S. firebombed the city of Tokyo, and it only took a few minutes for the city center to catch fire, and by the next day, 16 miles of the city were burnt to the ground. 267,000 buildings were gone, and the temperature of the fire caused even the canal to boil. 89,000 people living in the city were killed, and double that were wounded. By mid-June, Japan's 5 other industrial centers had been targeted. Cities like Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, Yokohama, and Kawasaki, which all totaled 260,000 dead, 2 million buildings gone, and 9 to 13 million people homeless. By July of 1945, 60% of their 60 largest cities were burned. American strategists argued that the devastation didn't seem to be curbing the Japanese dedication to the war. The food ration in Japan was reduced below the 1,500 necessary calories, and more than 1 million people were set to grubbing up pine roots to make aviation fuel. I mean, this is a desperate situation. Over 400 people were arrested in Japan on the suspicion that they might favor negotiating with the United States. So not giving in, just doubling down. Now into this comes the Manhattan Project. Now the Manhattan Project had begun in 1941 when President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, set up what he called the Uranium Committee. And by 1945, 120,000 people worked for the project. Now not all of them knew exactly what was going on, but they were all working towards the same goal even if they didn't know it. And they succeeded in separating uranium-235 and the synthetic element plutonium, and in developing mechanisms to explode both as warheads of bomber-borne weapons. By the middle of the summer, American strategists were irritated that Japan had not yet surrendered. On July 16, 1945, the first successful test of the atomic bomb was done in New Mexico. And in the following days, President Truman told Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union that the U.S. had atomic capabilities. On July 25th, 1945, the order was issued to General Karl Spaatz, commander of the Strategic Air Forces, to deliver the quote-unquote special bomb as soon as weather permitted after or about August 3rd on either Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagata, or Nagasaki. It was the uranium-235 version of the bomb that the B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 78,000 Japanese were dead or dying by the end of the day, and certainly hundreds of thousands have died in the decades afterwards from the radiation poisoning. When the Japanese still didn't surrender, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, also from a B-29 bomber, killing 25,000 people immediately. Now, these death numbers are really tough to estimate. Actually, I even have a different number on the screen there, 150,000 for Hiroshima, 75,000 for Nagasaki. They're so hard to get at because many people died in the days after. There were so many people hurt and injured and dying that not even all of them could be cataloged. So these are relatively conservative numbers, but honestly it could have been much higher, and certainly is much higher if you count all the people who died in the decades after from effects of the bombs. Here's a picture of one of the cities, I believe that's Hiroshima. Those were once city blocks that all had buildings on them. They're just annihilated. This is a woman whose, as you can see, her clothing was actually burned to her skin during the blast. Now, the traditional reason given for dropping the bomb was that an invasion of Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, perhaps even 1 million. Other historians have argued that, well, it was also because of the emerging Cold War. The Cold War has already started, and we'll talk more about that next week, but it's already started. Tensions between the US and the Soviets were already very high. And many historians have argued quite well that this was also about displaying to the Soviet Union that the United States had this capability. The US, the Soviets, and the Germans had all been working on nuclear technology. The US just got there first. So again, many historians have argued this was also about demonstrating power. But after the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, on August 15, 1945, Japan officially surrenders, and this is known as VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. The United States forces the Emperor Hirohito, to make his first ever radio broadcast telling the Japanese people that this is for real, Japan has surrendered. And they forced him to do that because the Emperor at the time held this very illustrious position where, I mean, you weren't even supposed to look at the Emperor, let alone hear his voice. So this was definitely sending a significant message. Now, some conclusions about the war in the Pacific. Japan was occupied by the United States until 1952. The United States will spend a tremendous amount of money rebuilding Japan, just as they will Europe, and we'll talk about that next week, but it's all about the Cold War. Roughly 31 million people died, both military and civilian deaths, in the Pacific alone. And when you add that to the 36.5 million in Europe, you've got a staggering death toll for the world for the Second World War. We end up in China with a very weakened nationalist party. The nationalists had managed to stay in power through the war, but a lot of Chinese are unhappy. They feel like the nationalists didn't do enough and that the communists actually do way more. And that allows the communists to take over China in 1949, and that's something that we're still living with the ramifications of today. Japan, as I said, is occupied until 1952. There are still American bases, especially in Okinawa, from the Second World War. And again, we will spend a lot of money to put Japan kind of back on its feet. And again, that's all due to the Cold War, because the United States felt like we needed as many countries as democracies and on the side of the US going into the Cold War. Japan's geographic position is right in the backyard of the Soviet Union, right across a very small sea from China, which became communist in 49. You see the picture here, the US gets very, very concerned. And this really paints a picture for where we're going next week, is that the US is consistently afraid during the Cold War period that more countries will turn communist. And so that will very much direct American foreign policy and a lot of the interactions between many countries in the post-World War II period.